let's talk about the recent adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein by Guillermo del Toro. This was an interesting adaptation because in many ways it is a very well put together film. The direction is great, the acting is great, and the storytelling is great. But in this video I want to explore whether or not it is good as an adaptation. And I'm going to be focusing on the ways in which it differs from Shelley's novel, because I do think it deviates in some interesting ways, and unfortunately I do think that often the ways in which it deviates does ultimately lessen the impact of the story. But I do want to begin by talking about something that I think is really positive about this adaptation, and how I think it stands out from a lot of other adaptations, not just that I've discussed on this channel, but in general. Adaptations that often take what I want to call a pick and mix approach to adaptation. These adaptations, what they'll do is they'll look at source material and they'll cherry pick the highlights, the characters that they like, the plot beats that they like, and then they'll cut the things that they don't like, whether that's for personal reasons, social reasons, or even creative reasons. It doesn't really matter what their reasoning is there. Now, the problem with this approach to adaptation is that authors, storytellers put things in their stories usually for specific reasons. And so if you're going to remove things, or mix a character together, blend two characters together rather, then you need to consider, well, what impact is this going to have on the broader ramifications within the story? A perfect example of a failed adaptation that did this pick and mix approach was Rafe Judkins' adaptation of The Wheel of Time. Now, I don't want to get too much into that. I could do a whole 10-hour video on how embarrassingly bad that adaptation is, but I do want to highlight it as an example of this poor approach, because I don't think that Del Toro's film does this. I think it actually adapts really well in this particular sense. So with The Wheel of Time, we have a gendered magic system in Jordan's original novel. There is a male half of the magic and a female half of the magic, which is called the source. And basically, the male half of this magic is tainted, and any man who uses it will eventually go mad, and so these men have to be controlled, have to have their magical abilities severed by the women. Now, the problem with this is that in this world, there's a prophecy that a male will come to save the world from the Dark One, and this is a problem in the world because if a male is doing that, and he has this magic, he might destroy the world as easily as he will make it. Now, Judkins didn't like the fact, obviously for maybe political and social reasons, that the prophecy was gendered and the magic system was gendered in this way, and so he did away with that. Instead, we had a gender-neutral prophecy. Oh, how modern. Now, that seems like it might be an innocuous thing, but actually it isn't, because if the prophecy is gender-neutral, then it dampens the stakes, because it doesn't necessarily matter if it's going to be a woman who is prophesied to do it, right? So that's one way in which making this change and not considering its consequences is pretty dumb. Another problem with downplaying the gendered nature of the magic is that gender and sex and the interrelations between the two are fundamental aspects of Jordan's story. And if you don't like them, then I'm sorry, but you just have no business doing a retelling of that story, because it is just a fundamental aspect of that story. So by removing this one aspect because he didn't like it, he damaged the overall story. He didn't consider the ramifications and didn't do anything in his storytelling to make up for those. Now onto Del Toro's Frankenstein, and this is a film that also makes creative, and I would call them genuinely creative, decisions. It's a film which really wants to focus on the creature as a sympathetic figure. Now this is present in Shelley's original, but the film in many ways goes much further to present the creature as a misunderstood figure. I think in part this is not just because Del Toro wants to focus on that aspect of Shelley's novel, but also perhaps he feels like he's doing some kind of work for the very poor adaptations in the past, the films that have made the monster out to be either sympathetic but ultimately stupid, or just an out-and-out monster. Nevertheless, as we'll explore later, he does go a little bit too far, I think, in making the creature sympathetic at the expense of the story as a whole. Nevertheless, what Del Toro does with his changes is he does consider their ramifications on the broader aspects of the story, and it's this in this sense that I think this adaptation succeeds on its own terms. Although I'll argue that it's not a very good, faithful adaptation of Shelley's novel, and that where some of those creative differences occur, I think Shelley generally comes out on top as telling a more compelling story with more interesting themes, I do think that as a film, as a unit, a self-contained story, it's a very good film, it's very considered, and ultimately it's very respectful to the source material even if it deviates. So let's start with why I don't think that Del Toro takes this pick and mix approach. And the reason for this is that one of the big changes in Del Toro's film compared to Shelley's is the creature himself. The creature in Shelley's novel is a wretch, and he's a wretch because he's very, very ugly. He's demonic in appearance, and people are terrified of the creature. No one ever gives him sympathy. There's a brief moment with the blind man, but that's quickly done over when the family come home. And so the monster really is wretched. He's outcast. And that is what drives his grief, his despair, and most importantly, his need for a companion. And in particular, his need for a companion to be a monster like him, because he's not going to get a human companion. Now, Del Toro's film makes the monster into a bit of a heartthrob. Jacob Elordi is playing him. He's a very attractive man, and he's not made that ugly by the makeup that he has to wear in this role. And the monster has lots of people who are sympathetic to him, including Elizabeth, and there's even a scene which implies that she maybe fancies him a little bit. There's a little bit of sexual, or at least romantic tension there, or romantic sympathy. Now, the problem with this change on the surface of it is, well, if the monster has people being kind to him, then his need for a companion that's just like him is essentially moot. And in a poor adaptation, that would be the case. You would just have the monster craving a companion, despite the fact that he can clearly get human companionship. But Del Toro notices this, and so makes some changes to the nature of the creature. He's indestructible, he's immortal, and so this changes this aspect of the story in a way that then works. It makes sense that the creature would want a companion like him, not because they need to be ugly like he is, which is what we get in the book, but because if he's going to live forever, he's going to need an immortal companion. So this is an example, and why I think that even though I do have some reservations as this stands as an adaptation, it's an example of why I think ultimately Del Toro is a very considered storyteller. He's making creative changes, he's aware that those things will change other aspects of the story, and he's then altering aspects of the story to make up for that, to make sure that it's still consistent. So it's a perfect example of a film where if you're going to adapt something, although I'd maybe say this is more of a retelling in some ways, but in any case, if you're going to do that, then you need to consider the ramifications of every change that you make. And I would say that on the whole, the film is pretty good at doing this. It's also a very good film in terms of the direction, in terms of the acting, all of that stuff I enjoyed. There's only some small things that I disliked. I found that sometimes it likes to beat you over the head with its themes a little bit too much. I think sometimes Del Toro feels like he has to tell the audience what the symbolism is. The symbolism, for example, behind Victor's name, we have to have that revealed in someone describing the definition of his name. I think we could have just left it with him being called Victor, really. And if people want to be a little bit nerdy and find out the meaning of that name, they can look it up themselves. And other things as well. Sometimes the characters' speeches feel a little bit too ranty and more like the writers wanting to get the themes out rather than characters organically expressing things. But these are ultimately moot points, and it can sometimes be very hard in films that are quite thematically heavy, and books as well, to not have those kinds of things. So on the whole, I think the film is well put together. However, I do want to talk about Victor and the creature and the ways in which I think that the creative decisions that Del Toro makes do lessen the impact of Shelley's theme. A story that ultimately is, I think, more generic, and also that doesn't really capitalize on the dichotomy between the creature and Victor. So I'll start with Victor and my issues with his characterization, because if the aim of Del Toro was to humanize the creature, he certainly did, but he did that very much at the expense of Victor. And most of the big changes also come, I think, in Victor's portion of the story. We still keep the framing device from the novel, which I really appreciated. And again, bit of a tangent, but I liked how he kept the dynamic between Victor and the captain having the men on his ship, the captain having this ambition to go ahead with their mission in the Arctic, and eventually turning back. I thought that was a great little detail, and I liked that was kept. In any case, getting back to Victor, his family backstory is one of the things that's changed the most in this film. And Victor's father in particular is completely done dirty. He's not done dirty in the sense that Charles Dance plays him, doing his best Tywin Lannister impression. However, in the novel, Victor's father is very affectionate. His family are very affectionate. They're very caring towards him. Also, Victor's father actually takes in Victor's mother, who was, I think, a noblewoman fallen on hard times. And so he takes her in, eventually they get married. Then we meet Elizabeth, who is someone else who is noble but fallen on hard times. They take her in as well. So you have this background with Victor of great charitable parents, really good people. And the shocking thing is how Victor then is driven by his ambition to create the creature and then not provide the creature with the kind of care and love that his father, creator, and also his mother gave to him. And I think that's a much more interesting story because, especially when we look at modern films, there is a tendency to have the sympathetic villain who's only the way he is because daddy was mean to him, and if daddy would only be loving, then everything would be fine. And that's fine, I suppose, but it is a bit tired at this point. And I did feel that with those opening scenes. In the film, instead, what we get is Charles Dance, who's a very severe medical man. He whips his son on across the face, so he's physically abusive. What a terrible twat. There's also some hints of like an Oedipal thing going on between Victor and his mum, which is never really continued. But the fact that she's always wearing red, and there's a scene with them when they're playing chess, I think, or something, and it sort of hints at it but doesn't go anywhere. And I just found this to be ultimately a lot more shallow compared to Shelley's novel, and it didn't really explore these different dynamics of parenthood in the way that the novel does, because you have these different shades, whereas in the film you just have horrible abusive dad. Victor turns out to be a horrible abusive dad as well to the creature. So I didn't really care for this change at all, even if I admired Dance's performance. I think as well, one thing that the novel has, which is a really subtle point, is that Victor's father does have one moment where he sort of pushes Victor possibly towards his crazy philosophical and scientific ideas. Victor is just starting to read up on the philosophies of, I think it's Agrippa, I want to say. Might be getting that wrong. But in any case, he's reading some esoteric, weird, mystical stuff. And his dad essentially mocks him lightly, not in a overly abusive way. But I like that. I like how the book plays with this idea that subtle remarks from even loving parents can have these long-lasting impressions. So it's a much more subtle kind of influence that the father has on the son there. Yes, he's a very good man on the whole, but this little comment sticks with Victor and possibly impacts what he does later. It's much more effective, much more subtle, and much less cliche than, oh, daddy was mean to me, and look, now I've turned into a meanie just like him, which is unfortunately the trope that the film falls into. Another problem that I found with Victor's characterization is that the film is very inconsistent about exactly what is driving Victor. At first, I thought it was just going to be, daddy's mean to me, and I'm going to become a monster just like him. But then when the mother dies, it's sort of implied maybe that it's more about, I want to bring her back, right? Because she died and she went away when I was so young, and it's the injustice of it all that kind of nonsense. So it was definitely going for a more sympathetic motivation there. But then we have these ranty speeches with Victor when he's like a man of science, and it's all about the science. And he doesn't really seem to engage with his past at all after that point. A little bit here and there maybe, but not that much. And then when it comes to the creature actually being created, Victor isn't immediately rejecting it like he does in the book. He is mesmerized, but ultimately he just gets bored because the creature's stupid. And I found that to be an odd character beat, because really everything about Victor's childhood and his relationship to his father and with his mother would imply that he actually wouldn't be that kind of person. The fact that his mother is, doted on him and he had that relationship that he still feels a lot for makes me think that ultimately he wouldn't be this cold man of science like his father would be. Just because daddy was mean, he still died when Victor was pretty young, just like his mother did. So the idea that that would be the overarching influence, I'm just not buying. And so it just seemed a bit off, really. And then, to make it worse, ultimately Victor's motivation for getting rid of the creature, he actually tries to kill it, rather than just running away like a coward, is that the creature possibly has the hots for Elizabeth, and Elizabeth might have the hots for him too. Which fundamentally makes Victor into just an out-and-out villain, really. It makes all of that backstory stuff irrelevant, because it's not really anything to do with daddy being mean anymore, or, ambition gone awry. It's just, you're jealous because, the creature's got the hots for the woman that you like, and maybe she likes it too, and so you're going to kill it. That just makes Victor out to be a genuine monster. Now, the book Victor has flaws, certainly. That's why he's a tragic hero. But we can somewhat sympathise with his fear of the monster that he's created. It's one thing in theory to have these crazy ideas, but when you're confronted with the reality of what you've done, that can be quite terrifying. And so we can sort of sympathise with Victor a little bit, at least at first. And then his main crime after that is cowardice. He's afraid of speaking up to protect Justine. He's afraid of speaking to Elizabeth to tell her about the creature and his family as well, and this leads to great tragedy. So he's a coward, he's ambitious, and all of those things, and certainly we can dislike him for that. But in the film, he's just an out-and-out monster, right? Killing something because, you know, they've got the hots for your girl is ridiculous. That is just a straight-up villain motivation. And so by making this change, Victor just becomes a much more unlikable character and not very complicated either. It's also odd just because so much of the early portion of the film was trying to garner sympathy and connect Victor's motivations to his childhood, but then the reality is it's got nothing to do with this. And bearing in mind that this is all within Victor's telling of the story, so it's not like Victor's motivations, true motivations, are being revealed by the creature here. This is all Victor's telling of the story. Another aspect of Victor's evilness is that all of the murders or killings that happen in this book are committed by him, not by the creature. It is him that kills Elizabeth, admittedly by accident, but still. He actually tries to kill the monster just because, like I say, just because of this love jealousy, rather than because the monster is doing terrible things, or he thinks the monster is doing terrible things, like Victor in the book. As misguided as that Victor is, he at least thinks that he's justified in killing something because it's evil, not because his girlfriend fancies it. So again, it's just a completely different motivation. And so again, it just makes Victor out to be the true villain of the story. He's not a misguided fool who, you know, goes too far with ambition and is a bit of a coward. He's just someone with terrible motivations who kills people, blames the monster for all his problems. And again, it makes it sort of odd. And this is one thing that I do think the story falls flat on, going back to my very first point in this video, is that by changing Victor in this way, I do find it less compelling that Victor would pursue the creature. Victor pursues the creature in the book because the creature takes away everything that Victor has. But in the film, it really is Victor who's taking everything away from himself because he's the one that actually kills all the people that he's close to. Now, you could say that in Victor's delusional mind, it's the creature that did this. Sure, but I'm just not compelled by that. Or at least I'm not as compelled by that as I am with the novel. And certainly, with the novel, I can feel for Victor a great sympathy towards the end because, you know, partly his own fault, but his life has been ruined in part by himself and by the creature, and so there really is nothing left. Whereas by having Victor basically create his own downfall and the monster just be a hapless victim, really, it just lessens the impact and makes it less convincing that he would go literally to the end of the earth to hunt the creature down. As I said earlier, I do think that Del Toro's motivations here was maybe to overemphasize or to emphasize the victim, you know, the fact that the creature is a victim of Victor in many ways. But I think by trying to go too far down the path of Daddy was mean to me, and by overemphasizing Victor's villainy, it does ultimately create a much flatter story, a less interesting story. One of the things that you can do with the books that you really can't do with the film is talk about the dichotomy between the monster and Victor and how they relate to each other. I just don't think that's possible in the film because Victor is made out to be such a horrible, contemptible human being, and the creature is so victimized that really it just doesn't make sense to do that anymore. And as we'll see, the creature really is a victim in the story. So I do want to say that my favourite part of the film was the early part of the creature's story. I thought that this was a great adaptation of the source material that was mostly faithful, and where it wasn't faithful, I thought in some ways it actually improved a little bit on Shelley's novel. One of the problems of Shelley's novel is the creature's education, and it's somewhat ridiculous the way that he sort of just educates himself by overhearing conversations and things. By having Victor, even though in some ways it comes with its own problems, but by having Victor spend some time with the creature trying to teach it, and then having the creature engage more with the old man, and, you know, the old man's blind, so it makes sense that he could be more accommodating because he doesn't have that visual horror that the characters have. I think actually by just giving more time to the creature's development, it just makes his development into a mature character more believable. So, like I say, I think that is one way in which I think this adaptation improves upon a weaker part of Shelley's novel. Nevertheless, as I said, The problem here a little bit is that Victor doesn't immediately reject the creature. So the creature doesn't have that immediate horror of just being outcast from birth. Victor turns against the creature slowly. The creature then goes out into the world after Victor tries to kill it. And we have a fantastic scene that is a perfect adaptation of a detail from the novel, which is that the creature is a vegetarian and very sympathetic to animals. And there's this little scene, I believe it's with a stag. The creature is eating some berries, so just visually communicating that that's his preferred food. And by having a prey animal there that he doesn't kill, you're further sort of visually symbolizing that he doesn't harm innocent creatures. And then you have two humans shoot the deer, and then also shoot the creature because they're horrified by his appearance. I thought that was a perfect way, in a very quick visual way, of just communicating the creature's innocence, his vegetarianism, if you like, and the brutality by comparison of the humans who shoot both the innocent animal and the innocent human as well, merely because his appearance scares them. Well, that was a perfect way to adapt that. I really enjoyed that bit. And again, it just shows that this film does, even where it takes creative liberties, it's very aware of the source material. It's got the details in hand. And I really appreciate that, when that sensitivity to the source material and that respect for the source material comes through in the film. There's no sense in this film that Del Toro thinks that he's superior to Shelley. He's inspired by her novel, and he wants to focus on the aspects of the novel that he finds compelling, and he, broadly speaking, tells a consistent story. So, as I said, in that sense, I do actually respect this film quite a lot. Nevertheless, I do think there are problems, and these problems come from basically a flip side to the problems with Victor, which is the overemphasizing of the creature's status as a victim. I can appreciate as a matter of film history that the creature has been done dirty either way so much, but I think that this adaptation goes too far in sympathizing with the creature. So the first way in which this happens is by, as I said previously, making, casting Jacob Elordi to play the monster and making the monster to be somewhat attractive, right? He's not overly done in prosthetics and all of that. He's not hideous in an extreme way. In fact, given that there's a war on at the time, I believe, one could probably believe that he's just got some scars from war and he's a bit pasty, not great, but more an object of sympathy, really, than horror. And so that does sometimes dampen the extreme violence he's sometimes met with by some of the strangers in the film, because he does just look a bit sick and a bit scarry, whereas he's meant to look like a genuine wretched creature that terrifies everyone that comes across him. A problem that I have with the creature's adaptation is that he really comes across as more sympathetic in one way and really less sympathetic in another. He's more sympathetic because he's just an out-and-out victim in a way that the book's version is not. The book's version ultimately does commit murders and crimes. The film version does not. The film version is almost killed by his creator rather than merely rejected just because of sexual jealousy. And so the creature in the film really does come across like a victim. In fact, he does kill sometimes with the sailors, I forget, but he does this in self-defense. So he's only ever causing violence in direct response to extreme harm. Whereas the monster from the books doesn't just do things in that case. He kills a child just because the child thinks it's a monster. So in that sense, the film version is much more sympathetic just because he's an out-and-out victim. Now, the way in which he's less sympathetic is that because he has human companionship, no one really is horrified by him. None of the central characters are just horrified by him just because. Yes, we have the people who shoot at him who just see him in the forest looking like a creep. Sure, you can sort of see why they would be horrified a little bit. But Victor isn't immediately horrified. Elizabeth seems attracted to him. And the old man, because he spends a lot of time there, like I said, this is why this is a bit of a problem, even if it fixes elements of Shelley's book. He has lots of human beings who are compassionate, who are kind. And so this makes him less sympathetic because he's not really ever as wretched in the film as he is in the book. In the book, the reason why you still sympathize with the monster when he kills is that he has tried with every single human that he has met to be loved, to do things for them. He's showed them great acts of kindness, and they just flee and scream and try and kill him. So he really has tried to connect with humans, and he's driven by extreme loneliness to commit the crimes that he does. The film version might not commit any crimes, per se, but he's not that sympathetic because he does have these moments of human connection. And so the tragedy of the monster is more just that Victor won't let him have these moments of human connection. If Victor just would leave the monster alone to get on with his life, the monster would probably be fine in a lot of ways. He could connect with Elizabeth. He could find someone else like the blind man, right? So that it just makes him less sympathetic in that sense. So I think by making that change, it does ultimately make the character less interesting than the book, which is a much more complex, complicated figure who invites lots of sympathy, but also lots of blame for the crimes that he commits. So ultimately, I am a bit conflicted about this film. I think, as I said, it is a respectful adaptation, and I respect the film on that basis. I think that the story itself is compelling and engaging in a lot of ways, but after all, it is an adaptation. It makes those creative changes, and even if they're consistent within the story itself, it's always interesting just to compare how the thematic changes, the character changes, how that changes the story as a whole. Does it make for a more in-depth exploration of the characters and how they relate to each other? Unfortunately, I do think this is where the film falls flat. By overemphasizing the victim status of the monster and overemphasizing Victor's villainy, it just creates a more simple good versus evil story. I do just see the Victor of this film as a nasty person. I don't think he's entitled to forgiveness at the end because none of his motivations are really justifiable. Trying to kill someone for romantic jealousy is just not... it's not an understandable motivation in the way that Victor's horror of his creation is in the original book. So I do think that in that way the film does fall flat. I don't really like that it relies on certain cliches either. Like, we just need to do away with the abusive father trope now. It's boring. It's tired. Give me a wicked stepmother. We haven't done that in a while. Or just leave that whole parents are evil shit alone and just do something else. And like I say, what I like about Shelley's novel is the fact that you have Victor, this pampered guy whose parents love him, whose parents are so charitable and kind to people who suffer, and then Victor turns out to be someone who does not do that when he makes a creature who lives a wretched life because of him. So I think that ultimately the way, I can respect the creative choices, I can respect the consistency of the story on one level, but compared to the source material, I do think it falls flat in many ways. That being said, I would recommend watching this film, not if you want a kind of, filmic summary of Shelley's novel, because I do think the creative decisions actually do take it quite far away from the story in the deep sense, even if it hits some of the plot beats of the story. But I would recommend it. I did enjoy watching it. And as I said, I'm always happy for adaptations that, show a respect for the source material, and that when they make those creative changes, they're considered, right? They just consider the impact on the rest of the story and they make changes. And in that way, the film succeeds completely. Anyway, that is it for this video. If you've seen Frankenstein, let me know down in the comments. Did you enjoy the film? Did you enjoy it as an adaptation? And how does it compare with other adaptations in the past? Because as adaptations go, this one has been done so many times. Although, as one commenter put in another video that I watched as a review of this, it would be nice if someone would just adapt the actual novel, given how many times it's been done, and still never really been done true to the original. In any case, take care everyone. Ta-ra.